That was the gavel. Welcome to our meeting. We're just going to get started so that we can get our full 2 hours in. Welcome to meeting number 71 of the Standing Committee on Science and Research. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to standing orders, and therefore members are attending in person in the room and also remotely using the Zoom application. For those participating virtually, just a few rules, and we also have witnesses virtual. You may speak in the official language of your choice. Interpretation services are available for this meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen for either floor, English, or French. If interpretation is lost, please inform me immediately and we'll ensure that interpretation is properly restored before we resume the proceedings. For the members in person, proceed as you normally would when the whole committee is here. I'll recognize you by name before you speak, and also keep your earphone away from your microphone so that we don't have the feedback events on the translators. We want to keep our translators safe throughout the meeting, so please watch out to make sure that your earphone and your microphone are separated. All comments coming through the chair, please. And now, pursuant to Standing Order 10831 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, September 18th, 2023, the committee resumes its study on the integration of Indigenous traditional knowledge and science in government policy development. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Erica Dick, Professor of History and Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in History in Health and Social Justice, And we also have Lindsay Heller, Indigenous Fellows from Simon Fraser University, the Morris J. Wask Center for Dialogue, also by video conference. And we're hoping to see Dr. Monica Williams shortly. Oh, she is here now? Great, thank you. So welcome to Dr. Williams, Canada Research Chair and Professor at the University of Ottawa. Each individual has 5 minutes for opening comments, after which we will go to our rounds of questioning. And I'll signal you when we're getting close to time. So now to start us off, we'll have Dr. Erica Dick. For 5 minutes, please, Dr. Dick.
Thank you very much. Dear honorable members, my name, as mentioned, is Erica Dick. I'm a historian and a Canada Research Chair in the history of health and social justice at the University of Saskatchewan. I've been studying the history of psychedelics for over 20 years, and my research has been published in a number of scholarly books, articles, and documentaries and podcasts. Initially, my research focused on medical experiments that were conducted in Canada in the 1950s and 60s using substances like D-lysergic acid diethylmide, LSD, mescaline from the peyote cactus, and psilocybin found in magic mushrooms, including the studies that were conducted in Saskatchewan that coined the term psychedelic in 1957. By the 1970s and 80s, psychedelic drugs had earned a reputation as dangerous substances with links to a history of mind control, violent behavior, and unwanted side effects like flashbacks. Canada, like most Western nations, signed a UN convention in 1971 agreeing to ban the use of psychedelics in human research due to concerns about their capacity to cause addiction and stimulate unwanted behaviors. The only exception to this designation was Indigenous uses for ceremonial or religious purposes. The relationship between Indigenous uses of psychedelics in Canadian history is particularly complicated. While there are a handful of registered religious exemptions stemming as far back as the 1950s, much of this history is not well understood and is not well documented. For much of Canadian history, Indigenous traditions were under threat and some expressly prohibited by the Indian Act. While the word psychedelic was not coined until 1957, the concept of altering one's state of consciousness, of course, is not unique to psychedelics. However, due to colonial pressures to adopt Western medicine and laws prohibiting Indigenous spiritual traditions, our documented understanding of Indigenous customs with psychedelic practices or principles is severely limited. The clearest evidence comes from the Native American Church, which has been a registered religious organization since the late 1950s. There has historically been one legal chapter in Canada and several legal chapters in the United States and Mexico. The Native American Church includes many sacred features, including the use of the peyote cactus, which contains a psychoactive alkaloid called mescaline. Mescaline was first identified by German chemists in 1896, but the practice of peyoteism stretches back hundreds of years. Most written accounts of peyoteism, or the worship of peyote, come come from the church itself, as it sought legal recognition in the early part of the 20th century. That formal recognition represented a syncretic religion, a blending of Christian and indigenous practices of worship, including the medicine or sacrament of the peyote cactus. Now, the peyote cactus does not naturally grow in Canada. It grows in parts of Texas and northern Mexico, and anthropologists have tracked peyote pilgrimages and kinship ties to that region for centuries, further suggesting that practices long predate the formal documented recognition. There are several historical reasons why we lack information about Indigenous practices with psychedelics. First, the practices themselves have been prohibited, stigmatized, or explicitly illegal, meaning that without oral testimonies or direct information, we lack documented detail about these practices that sometimes occurred in secret. Second, ethnobotanists and anthropologists working with Indigenous communities across Canada have suggested that many ceremonies, practices, and traditions do not single out a psychedelic feature. And by that, I mean there are diverse practices or traditions that involve different components, which might include fasting, dancing, singing, praying, features that can produce alterations in consciousness. By fixing on the inclusion or exclusion of a psychedelic plant or fungi, this has distorted our Western understanding of how these traditions use sacred plants in combination with other observances. And finally, even academic researchers who studied these Indigenous traditions in the 1940s through the 1970s were subjected to stigma and associated with psychedelics. Some now suggest that there has been a microphobic bias in the literature, suggesting that these studies were not taken seriously or published at all. I finally want to note that historically, Canadian medical researchers played a leading role in developing therapeutic applications for psychedelics. In my opinion, the best examples of effective treatments from the 1950s and 60s came from researchers who genuinely engaged with Indigenous leaders and who paid close attention to how ceremonies were structured. Collaboration between the Native American Church and psychedelic researchers in Saskatchewan, for example, led to the development of some of the first published protocols on the safe use of psychedelics in group therapy, and Native American church leaders were crucial for informing non-Indigenous researchers on how to prepare for an experience. And in return, non-Indigenous researchers testified to committees like this one as to the cultural significance of the peyote ceremony. Thank you very much for your time to speak on this important issue.
Thank you very much for your testimony, right on time. Now we'll go to Lindsay Heller for 5 minutes, please. Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for this opportunity to share some important observations that I have made over the years in my experience weaving Indigenous knowledge and science with Western science. My name is Lindsay Heller, and my Cree name is Nagamuin Muskegee. I'm a member of the Michel First Nation in Treaty 6 territory. I spent 10 years as a pharmaceutical research scientist at the Center for Drug Research and Development, and am now in my 4th year as a fellow at SFU Center for Dialogue, where my focus is on weaving Indigenous science and Western science in both educational settings as well as for informing government policy for a variety of levels of government. The many wise witnesses that have come before me have spoken about the importance of establishing respectful and reciprocal relationships with Indigenous knowledge keepers when collaborating on projects and policies that involve weaving Indigenous knowledge in Western science. And I agree that that is a critical first step. In addition to that, so is doing your homework prior to reaching out to Indigenous knowledge keepers. Learn what has already been done. Learn where there have been errors and issues. Learn what the community is facing that may come into play when attempting to collaborate with and weave Indigenous knowledge and Western science. As somebody who worked for many years in a lab focused on a Western science approach, I want to take the little time that I have today to ensure that you understand that the often perceived hierarchy of Western science over Indigenous science is not correct. And this assumption often leads to errors, risks, repeating of harms, and failures of projects and policies that attempt to weave Indigenous science and Western science together. I have often heard Western scientists and government officials justify their beliefs in the supremacy of Western science based on the value of the scientific method. They infer that Indigenous people do not utilize the scientific method, which they consider the pinnacle of Western thought. The scientific method follows a fairly linear path: observation, formulating a question, hypothesis, experimentation, analysis, conclusion, peer review, and results sharing. Western scientific experiments follow this formula, and the results are published in scientific journals. This publication of results established a hierarchy where published scientific data is the best and anything else is inferior. I always counter this argument by stating that Indigenous people too follow the scientific method, and that the consequences of failure go far beyond a failed experiment or exclusion from a journal. Experimentation by Indigenous people is built on observations and interpretations of the natural world, which allow us to predict how parts of the world work. These experiments are repeatable, reliable, have rigor, are accurate, and also follow a peer review process. If Indigenous people didn't have a sound and reliable scientific method, the results could be much more devastating than one typically imagines. If our observations about the sea ice in the north, our predictions, experimentation, data collection, peer review, and result sharing is incorrect, it can mean falling through the ice and perishing. If our observations and results are incorrect with regards to traditional plant medicines, it could mean poisoning our families and not passing on our genes to the next generation. If our observations and results sharing about the movement and distribution of a caribou herd are incorrect, it could mean our community has no meat for the winter. While this kind of experimentation may take more time than it would in a laboratory setting, the rigor, accuracy, and replicability is sound. Is this not also the scientific method? When the consequences of not using this Indigenous scientific method could be death, would you not rely on this data and view it as valuable, intelligent, and reliable? I share these observations so that when governments establish programs and policies to work with Indigenous knowledge keepers to weave Indigenous knowledge and Western science together, they are doing so from a place of respect and understanding that our methods are sound and deserve careful consideration and inclusion. Whether you're looking at the Species at Risk Act or creating policies that involve curriculum development or any other number of programs that would benefit from the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge, it is critical to do so from a place of respect, without an assumption that the Western scientific way is more important or more trustworthy. You must consider reciprocity. What is the community or individual gaining from collaborating with you? You need a deep knowledge of what that community is facing. Do they have clean drinking water and adequate housing? Because if they don't, perhaps their priority isn't the same as yours. You must also understand that there may be an inherent distrust in government due to decades of theft, disenfranchisement, violence, and broken promises. The process of healing and reconciliation must be at the forefront of these kinds of projects and policies. After all, it isn't an Indigenous worldview that has gotten our world into this mess of climate change, mass extinction, and resource extraction disasters and food insecurity. It was a Western worldview that did this. So by working together and weaving our Indigenous knowledge systems, approaches, and values together, I believe that we do stand a chance of getting ourselves out of this mess. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much for your comments, your presentation. I look forward to the questions on this. And now for 5 minutes to Dr. Monica Williams from the U of Ottawa.
Thank you for having me. My name is Dr. Monica Williams. I'm an African American and permanent resident of Canada. I'm a board certified licensed clinical psychologist and tenured professor at the University of Ottawa in the School of Psychology, where I serve as a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Mental Health Disparities. I graduated from MIT and received my doctorate at the University of Virginia. My research focuses on culture, racism, and mental health. I've founded mental health clinics in Virginia, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and Ottawa, and a refugee clinic in Kentucky. I provide supervision and training to mental health clinicians for culturally informed, empirically supported treatments. I also provide diversity trainings internationally for clinical psychology programs, scientific conferences, and community organizations. Prior to my move to Canada in 2019, I was on the faculty of the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, the University of Louisville, and then the University of Connecticut, where I had appointments in both psychological science and psychiatry. I've published over 200 scientific articles, and I'm a member of the Royal Society of Canada. My current research includes addressing barriers to care, the assessment of racial trauma, improving cultural competence and the delivery of mental health care services, and interventions to reduce racism. Although I'm not an Indigenous person, as a scholar of racism, I can confirm that Indigenous people experience striking social and societal discrimination that adversely affects their mental health and well-being. My work with Indigenous people in Canada includes in-depth mental health assessments for several Indigenous women, including some who are subjected to coerced or involuntary sterilization by the Saskatoon Health Authority. I also conducted a nationwide study of mental health needs of diverse Canadians that was published in the International Journal of Mental Health last year. The findings with respect to Indigenous people were significant and dovetailed other research indicating that Indigenous people receive poor quality of care. 69% said they had experienced difficulties accessing mental health care, significantly more than white Canadians. Indigenous Canadians reported more financial barriers to care than other groups, and even more than other Canadians of color. And the most striking of the findings was that half reported negative experiences with mental health care providers, which we know creates a barrier in terms of treatment adherence and follow-up care. There are a few critical take-home messages here. For one, we need to incorporate Indigenous approaches into how we deliver healthcare to make it more relevant and palatable for our Indigenous citizens. Secondly, we need more Indigenous clinicians. There are not enough Indigenous providers to provide culturally relevant care to this often highly traumatized population. In 2018, the Canadian Psychological Association drafted a response to the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission report and stated that there are likely fewer than 12 Indigenous practicing or teaching psychologists in Canada. And that would mean only 0.0006% of the 19,000 psychologists in Canada identify as Indigenous. Notably, psychologists function not only as mental health care providers, but also as researchers and scientists. Those best suited to integrate Indigenous traditional knowledge and science into government policy are Indigenous people themselves. Not only do we need to ensure the active involvement of Indigenous people from various regions within Canada, but these efforts need to be led by Indigenous scholars and approved by Indigenous leaders. And we need to first ask ourselves why there are so precious few Indigenous scientists and scholars in Canada in the first place. Less than 2 years ago, I admitted the first Indigenous student into University of Ottawa's doctoral program in clinical psychology. And so I've had a front row seat to the institutional barriers she faces to get the education she needs to become a scholar who can conduct the very research needed to benefit her communities. Earlier last year, I conducted a study of the experiences of racialized employees in the federal government for the Office of the Auditor General. And this included the Canadian Border Services, Correctional Services, the Department of Justice, the Public Prosecution Services, Public Safety, and the RCMP. The employees shared with us over and over again that the rules and policies were ignored as employees of color experienced unchecked racism that prevented career advancement, and they were subject to retaliation if they reported it. So we can come up with all the good policies we like, but you must understand that if you don't address the systemic racism that infects our institutions at every level, none of it will make a difference. Adopting Indigenous knowledge requires us to understand and address the discrimination and systemic barriers that make these changes so challenging in the first place. Thank you.
Terrific. What a great panel of witnesses. Thank you all for your testimony this morning. We're going to move over to questions. First, I'll welcome Dr. Brendan Hanley as a substitute, and we also have Daryl Sampson online as a substitute. So it's great to have you join our committee this morning. Our first round of questions goes to Corey Tucker from the Conservatives. For 6 minutes, please, Corey.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. My first question for Professor Dick, regarding the potential therapeutic benefits of medicines like psilocybin, can you speak to the contemporary research on the medical benefits of these therapies?
I feel like Monica Williams is better positioned to answer this question, to be honest, but I'll say briefly that over the last 12 years, the evidence on psilocybin applications for therapeutic use have really blossomed. There's a growing number of papers and actually just an enormous amount of evidence now suggesting that psilocybin is performing well in clinical trials, including the American FDA identifying psilocybin as a breakthrough therapy for the treatment of major depression disorder, as well as for post-traumatic stress disorder. I may leave
switch
it to Monica.
Just for a really brief synopsis of your answer to that question, then I got a follow-up question for Professor Dyke.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's been so much research that's been done right now that's going on in the U.S. and in Canada. In fact, Canada has been a leader in some of this work, showing the benefits of substances like psilocybin for end-of-life distress and other indications such as anxiety, PTSD, and depression, as well as substances like MDMA and ketamine and many others that are emerging.
It's complicated when you start. Thank you very much. And then my follow-up question to Professor Dick is, we keep hearing that the special access program and some of the failures with that program. In your mind, is it working? And maybe that might be a group question with Monica following up as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a historian looking at this from 10,000 feet, so that may, Monica will have a much closer up impression. As I understand, the Special Access Program has been increasingly used over the Section 56 exemptions in the last couple of years. And this creates this puts more pressure on psychiatrists to act as the gatekeepers to access to psychedelics. And I think there are still challenges with respect to access to good supplies, safe supplies. Certainly that was a problem even 3 years ago when the exemptions were coming through, the Section 56 exemptions came through. So I think it is moving in the right direction, but it still seems to be that there's a real backlog.
And Monica, just on that, just to focus on the psilocybin aspect of things, what needs to be improved for the Special Access Program for it to work?
Right. Well, first of all, I think we need more clinicians who have the right training and skills in order to conduct psychedelic-assisted therapies and to prescribe those medicines. But also, I think that the nature of the program, it does pose barriers to people who may be marginalized, who may have fewer resources, who may not have access to psychiatrists, and if they do, may not have the type of relationship that they need to feel that they can trust those providers. And so I think we really need to do a deep dive and look at the demographics of the people who are accessing this program, including racial and ethnic demographics, to ensure that that it's being rolled out equitably. To my knowledge, that this information isn't really being collected in a systemic way. And so that would make it really hard to say conclusively who this program is benefiting and who it isn't.
Thank you so much, Monica. And I got another question. And you're probably aware of last fall there was a subcommittee in the Senate that produced The Time Is Now, a study on the failure of the federal government for veterans with psilocybin. Can you talk briefly about the benefits of these therapies for veterans specifically?
Right. Well, we know that a lot of the empirically supported treatments for PTSD, although they're effective, they're not effective for everyone. And there's so many people who've served our country who are suffering from PTSD and are not able to have a good quality of life because they've done all the treatments, they've tried all the medicines, and they're still suffering. We see a lot of veterans actually going to other countries, going on trips to places like Jamaica and South America, where they can get psychedelic substances to relieve their PTSD. And believe me, they wouldn't keep going and sending them if it wasn't working, right? So I think that we really owe our veterans the best that we have to offer. And that means if other things haven't worked, well, why not psychedelics? We have the research that shows that it can help so many people. And I think it would really be a vital option for veterans.
Thank you, both of you. I believe my time is up.
You've got a minute.
Oh, well.
You've got 6 minutes.
Back to Professor Dick. Just talk about the Indigenous aspect. Do you know of any Indigenous individual that has harmed themselves or others on psilocybin? I cannot find any, but have you, throughout your history of or study of the history of Indigenous people, are there any that you know of?
I don't know of any offhand. I have been working closely with the Native American Church and leaders from current and past leaders from that, and mostly they work with peyote, not psilocybin, but there too, there have been no reported abuses in that specific transaction. Of course, there are, as our other witness, as Lindsay mentioned, I mean, there are all sorts of other issues that are going on. Access to drinking water is a huge issue that overwhelms the conversations about concerns about particular drug abuses, if you will.
Great. Thank you.
I think that can't be taken out.
That's great. Thank you. And before we go to the next questioner, Dr. Williams, if you could just raise your mic a little bit so that it's level with between your mouth and your nose. That's perfect. Thank you. We'll see how that works for our translators. And to Ryan Turnbull for 6 minutes, please, from the Liberals.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to all the witnesses for being here today. Fascinating opening remarks, and really value the perspectives that you're bringing to this important study. I want to ask Ms. Heller about, I really enjoyed your opening remarks, and I found them to be challenging the dominant paradigm or the supremacy of Western science as being sort of, something that probably many of us as settlers take for granted. And I really appreciated your comment about how Indigenous traditional knowledge does follow a rigorous scientific method, and that it has rigor and soundness, and that certainly there would be dire consequences if some of your observations and results turned out to be false, which I think is a really good way of pointing to the accuracy, I think the imperative of that knowledge being really accurate and really applicable. So I'd take all that as really great opening remarks. I wanted to ask a question. You almost made me start to think about how we as Western settlers need to sort of decolonize our understanding, in a sense, that the systemic barriers that I think are really entrenched in our ways of knowing. And so I wanted to ask you what we're up against, because I'm sure if we're allies in that quest to remove those systemic barriers and really give Indigenous traditional knowledge the legitimacy that it so rightly deserves. And again, I want to rephrase that, because we shouldn't be giving anything to anybody, but at the same time, I think it's many of us settlers that probably have to change our mindset. Can you help us with that? Like, what advice could you give us that would really help and aid in that journey?
Oh, that's a good question. Do we have an hour to talk about it?
Yes.
I think Monica brought this up importantly, that there's not enough Indigenous scientists. There's not enough people like me that are doing this work. And so I think supporting, through curriculum, through removing barriers in educational systems, through allowing Indigenous people to see themselves at the front of the classroom, to see themselves in the curriculum, to look at assessment differently, to really decolonize education so that Indigenous people can bring the gifts that they receive through knowledge from our ancestors, through ceremony, through our language, and weave that together with the really important things that we learn in those institutions, becoming chemists, becoming biologists. And I think, additionally, having respect and collaboration at the forefront of all of these projects. That's why I decided to take my short amount of time to position Indigenous knowledge as sound and intelligent and reliable, because that's often not the case. And so I think, going into these partnerships and taking the time to listen to hear instead of listening to respond, and get to know the people that you're working with, get to understand what language means to us, what ceremony means to us. And then based on those respectful relationships, then moving on in a collaborative relational way.
Yeah, thank you for that response. And I building on the concept of respect and reciprocity, which I think you mentioned in your opening remarks as well, which seems to be so foundational in this conversation. One of the things that is interesting to me is when I think about that, I think that people have to be sort of looking and I think about it as standing on mountaintops. Like there's Western science and individuals with that way of knowing standing on a mountaintop, and there's Indigenous knowledge keepers that are standing on a mountaintop. And we need to both be looking across and looking up to each other in a way. And that to me is kind of a sign of respect and reciprocity, when we can each recognize the unique value in each other's way of knowing. And so I wanted to ask whether, because sometimes in our conversations I feel like we're still treating Western science as having primacy, and thinking about how Indigenous traditional knowledge can add on to Western science or complement it. But what if we flipped it the other way around? I think it would look very different. And I wonder if any of the panelists today could talk about if we were to give Indigenous traditional knowledge primacy, which I think it deserves, how would Western science complement it?
We have about 45 seconds. And Ms. Heller, if you could move your microphone up just a little bit for the interpreters as well. Who's going to start off on this one?
I mean, I guess I can just take those 30 seconds and, in my very last statement, talking about how Indigenous worldviews aren't what got us into this in the first place. And so I think, taking the time to really understand what an Indigenous worldview is, what it means to be relational with all living things. We're not standing on top of the mountain. We're standing beside the mountain. We're standing with the mountain. We're standing with all of the living things. We're going into ceremony to remember who we are and remember the responsibility that we have to all living things. And I think if government officials and Western scientists can take a bit of a pause and reorient their access to understand that we are all part of a complex web of connections, I think that we can move forward in a good way.
Great, thank you. Great question and great answer. To Maxime Blanchet-Chocat for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. The first questions will be for Ms. Dick. Ms. Dick, you are a professor of history, but you're also the professor of history and Canada Research Chair in History of Health and Social Justice. I've read the certain things, and I've spoken with certain professors, and we've heard that science should be universal. Science should not have any national or ethnic stripe to it. We've heard about Western knowledge and Indigenous knowledge. Can you tell us how is it that science is categorized from a national or ethnic way? I'll say, for example, there are Arabic numbers, but we don't call any form of science Arabic. Can you talk about this national or ethnic distinction for science?
That's a very difficult question. I think there are two things. One is the funding bodies that give priority and sometimes create particular kinds of steps in the ways or definitions in how we identify science, how it's funded, and therefore some of the projects that can go forward. Those, of course, give a kind of national presence to it, and they create a different set of priorities. That undergirds some of these ideas about the sort of national containers, I would say, that science exists in. If we think about this in the context of Indigenous knowledge, though, and to Lindsay's point, I think a reordering, imagining different priorities, also imagining different aspects of science that we don't necessarily consider within the Western frame of science. Spirituality, for example, if we come back to those veterans, some of what is being treated here is a spiritual set of disorders that has not, for the last 75 years, fit neatly into our Western biomedical ideas. And I'm saying Western, not national, I understand. By rearranging that and reimagining those priorities, I think we can imagine a different way of integrating, whether it's Indigenous knowledge or other ways of seeing, other ways of prioritizing the kinds of health needs, and that relationship to the earth is part of that.
Merci, Madame Dick. Donc,
Thank you, Ms. Dick. What you're saying, if I understand well, is to integrate Indigenous knowledge into Western science. How can we do this in a way, rather, we've seen that when Western science, for a belief to make it to knowledge, it needs to be verified. So how can we integrate Indigenous knowledge into this? And then how can we determine what is true from what is false?
My work with Indigenous communities, albeit limited as myself, a settler, suggests to me that we have to ask different questions. We have to let other people lead. We have to take cues in other ways. That the question about psychedelics, for example, is an instructive one. asking about psychedelics doesn't actually get to the kinds of priority questions within the Indigenous communities that I've worked in. The questions are about safe access to housing, safe access to water and food systems, to education systems for their children. Psychedelics are not really the priority, and yet psychedelics are part of the world we live in and part of the ceremonies sometimes that Indigenous people are participating in. So it's really a reimagining of the priorities of the health priorities that sometimes don't necessarily fit into a neat category that we think of as science per se.
OK. D'accord. Madame Dick,
I understand. Ms. Dick, just to understand, you say that we need to look at things differently. Are you suggesting that we review the entire scientific process when determining knowledge?
I don't know that we need to re-examine the entire scientific process, but I think there are aspects that warrant revisiting. Take, for example, the place of randomized controlled trials. When we think about that in the context of psychedelics, they are measuring a very specific pharmacological action, and what they don't measure are all of the kind of interactions with environment, all the kinds of personal and emotional interactions that occur when someone consumes psychedelics. Indigenous ceremonies don't treat psychedelics like a randomized controlled trial. It completely reorients the interaction and the experience. And I think listening and learning about why those ceremonies exist and what functions they serve could be very instructive for imagining what meaning we are trying to extract from that pharmacological reaction.
OK. Madame Dick, pour conclure,
Ms. Dick, one final question. I've asked this question to other witnesses, and I'd like to hear your answer as well. How do we distinguish knowledge from a belief?
30 seconds.
I think this is also very difficult. Right now, knowledge for me as a professor counts when I publish things in peer-reviewed literature, and beliefs don't necessarily get me points on my CV. And I think sometimes these systematic ways of giving credit or cultural value to knowledge and belief doesn't get that same kind of cultural credit. And I think that's something that our funding systems reinforce.
Discussion. Thank you. And on to Mr. Cannings for 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you again to all the witnesses for being here today. I'm going to start with Dr. Heller. We're in a study here about somehow bringing together, science as we normally think of it in Western settler societies and Indigenous knowledge. We've heard a number of witnesses use words like to weave, to braid. I'm just wondering if you, I think, mentioned the word weave, and just if you could expand on that, how you see these two ways of seeing the world, how we can use both of them in informing government policy.
Yeah, I think it's important that you raise this because I'm uncomfortable with the word integration. It can often be seen as consuming one into the other. And weaving or braiding is, taking the strengths of each knowledge system and putting them together to create something even stronger. And so I think, coming back to what I've talked about in a couple of my comments is about an Indigenous worldview. We see the forest as a them as opposed to an it. And you're much less likely to raise that forest to the ground when you see it as a relative, as opposed to seeing it as something there for you to consume and benefit from. So, I'm going to leave it at that.
Okay, I'm going to dive down into a little more, I guess, a detailed example. Dr. Heller, you mentioned the Species at Risk Act as one example of where this process happens. In my previous life, I was on the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. It was, I think, one of the first government agencies or government adjacent agencies that brought in Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous knowledge keepers into its membership. And it certainly, in those early days, was a bit of a struggle even finding, who should sit on there to represent Indigenous knowledge, et cetera. All the things the government needs to be careful about was a difficult matter. And I'm just wondering if you could, using that example, how Indigenous knowledge has been used in the Species at Risk Act, if you're familiar with that, and perhaps how you think it should be used, if you think there's better ways.
Well, I think when you're talking about particular species and the land protections that are going to come along with SARA, with the Species at Risk Act, understanding, the populations of this animal before contact, taking into consideration the cultural uses for that animal, thinking about the different land uses that come into play for that particular animal. I think, having a community that has a deep knowledge of that land. So, a land-based perspective is critical, as opposed to, officials or scientists who may sort of parachute in and use, also sound data. So weaving together those two approaches to data collection to make decisions about this animal. And I think it's also really critical to consider what that community will be facing in the aftermath of coming in and putting in land protections, because oftentimes an Indigenous community can be blamed for land use restrictions, and the harms that they can face when that comes into play are something that is often not considered and must be considered.
1.5 minutes. I'll just continue with talking about some of the issues I've encountered in this space, and that is, some Indigenous knowledge keepers, I think perhaps you mentioned this, but there's a consideration that in some cases, or many cases, that knowledge is considered proprietary to that person or that family, and they're unwilling to share it with government policymakers. If you can just perhaps comment on that and how we can move forward in situations like that.
Yeah, I did mention this, that there is an inherent distrust because of theft of knowledge. And so, and that's why taking the time to establish a relationship with these individuals so that you can build that trust, why do they want to share that knowledge with you if they feel like it might not be used in a good way that's going to benefit not only them, but their community and all the living beings that are around there? So I think, taking the time to get to know these individuals, to get to know what that community is facing, to get to know the historical aspects of what that community has faced and is facing, and go into that relationship to build that trust and to really establish a basis for doing this work together, a willingness to learn, a willingness to hear the answer of no, that is not our priority. I think that that positions this kind of work in a different way, and Indigenous communities and knowledge keepers are much more likely to want to participate when things are done a little bit differently. Thank you.
Great,
Thank you.
I apologize for having to be the timekeeper on this discussion, but in the next round, we're going to have to do some trimming to get us to the top of the hour. So we're going to do 3.5, 3.5, 1.5, 1.5 for our questions. So starting with 3.5 minutes for Michelle Rempel-Garner.
Thank you, Chair. So I'll direct my questions to Drs. Dick and Heller. Michael Pollan, he is an American author and journalist. He is a professor in the practice of nonfiction at Harvard University. But in 2020, he co-founded the UC Berkeley Center on the Science of Psychedelics. And if you look at some of the book reviews for this very famous book, How to Change Your Mind, which talked about the use of psychedelics, some of like glowing reviews, gripping and surprising, makes losing your mind sound like the most sanest thing a person could do. New York Times book review. Astounding, New York Times Magazine. It's been amusing to me, perhaps that's not the right word, amusing and disappointing to watch the world kind of all of a sudden go, oh, psychedelics could be used for mental health work after Michael Pollan's book. And I think this is a perfect example of some of the things you were speaking about, Dr. Williams. Was there anything fundamentally transformational in Michael Pollan's book, or is it just basically a collection of Indigenous knowledge? And why does it still take a Michael Pollan to get Indigenous traditional knowledge accepted as mainstream practice?
Would you like me to answer that? Yeah. So this is actually true and unfortunate. Almost everything we know about psychedelic assisted therapy has come from Indigenous practices that have been westernized and appropriated, actually, with very little credit or recognition or glory or money going back to the original sources of these knowledge and this knowledge and these techniques. And actually, if you read the book, which I have read the book, it reads like I don't know, pantheon of white men getting the credit for all of the psychedelic research that's been done, in the last century. And unfortunately, this is often how we determine what's important. Like, did white men discover it, and are they talking about it, and are they publicizing it? And that's exactly what we see with Michael Pollan's book. To your point, he is not an expert in psychedelics. He's not a clinician. He doesn't have an MD or a PhD, but he gets he gets a lot of attention, because he wrote a best-selling book.
Dr. Dick.
Sure. Yes, I think Michael Pollan has really synthesized a lot of what people have been saying for a number of years and has put that kind of mainstream gloss on it, which is further, I think, damaged or muted the contributions of Indigenous people for centuries. And he's sort of put this veneer on it that has made it sort of splash into the mainstream. But he does a disservice to the many people who've been working in this field for a long time across a variety of different cultures and backgrounds around the globe, really.
Close with this, Chair. In my time, pre-politics, during politics, have always found that the most expedient way to get something done is to figure out how to get a man to think it was his idea. So I hope that this committee can come up with a better recommendation on how to get Indigenous knowledge into the mainstream than that.
Thank you. Thank you for the great insights. And now over to Dr. Jasek for 3.5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Chair. And yes, a fascinating panel of witnesses today. Like my colleague, Mr. Turnbull, I would really like to commend Ms. Heller for her very clear articulation that it is a very artificial division that seems to be made between what we are calling Western science and Indigenous knowledge, which of course is based on observational scientific methods as well. So sometimes it is helpful to counter the discrimination that is clearly there in terms of what is currently considered Indigenous knowledge by telling stories. And we've heard a little bit about psychedelics today, but are there other examples? Perhaps, Ms. Heller, you could give us some other examples where the weaving of Indigenous observational science has been incorporated into research that has had a lasting effect, some sort of positive outcome that everyone can acknowledge. Any kind of concrete example of that kind of research that has been published and is widely acknowledged to have advanced science in its full sense?
Oh my goodness. There are a number of actively use therapeutics and anti-cancer medicines that were discovered, and I'm using air quotes for those that are sight impaired, by Western scientists, but were directed to those researchers by Indigenous people as as plants. Pacific yew, for example, that were used since time immemorial to treat a number of ailments, and some of these anti-cancer drugs are some of the largest money making drugs that big pharma is using. So, I mean, just in drug discovery alone, there are a number of examples, and I think the anti-cancer medicines is one that I would point to.
I think that's very
quite frankly,
helpful.
the people. I was just going to say, quite frankly, the people that the Indigenous communities that offered that medicine were arguably not compensated for that sharing of knowledge, and it's what has led to the distrust and the hesitancy in sharing some of that knowledge now.
Dr. Williams, are you aware of some, as we are moving forward with weaving Indigenous knowledge with Western science, what about some outcomes in terms of health outcomes? Have you observed, have you documented any positive results in terms of integrating, in terms of the usual measures of successful outcome? Perinatal mortality decreasing in perhaps Indigenous populations, longevity, life expectancy, quality of life, anything that can be pointed to as a successful outcome where integration has occurred or weaving has occurred.
I'm sorry, we're at the end of time, but maybe we could ask for a response in writing if that's available to us. That would help our study. And now we'll go over to Maxime Blanchet-Choquin for 1.5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Ma question...
Thank you, Chair. My question is for Professor Williams. Professor Williams, you are the Canada Research Chair on mental health disparities. The objective of your research chair is to offer better health, mental health care for Indigenous peoples. Can you help us determine where to trace the line between the use of science and, because your research chair also mentions a more patient-centered approach beyond knowledge. And so I'd like to say, how do we distinguish this between traditional knowledge? I'll give you an example. In 2014, a judge gave Indigenous peoples the right to refuse chemotherapy. Indigenous plaintiffs in this case used an ancestral medicine to treat her cancer. Chemotherapy had a 75% chance of success, but she didn't take it, and she died 2 months following the decision that was handed down. How, in your opinion, can you respect knowledge while applying science?
Yes, thank you for your question. I mean, ultimately, I am a scientist and I do use the scientific method. And so I would approach this looking at outcomes and offer patients, this is what we know about this approach. This is what we know about this Indigenous approach. We may not know anything about the Indigenous approach as far as we would explain that using our own scientific methods. That doesn't mean it's without value. Ultimately, it has to be like the choice of the patient, what approach to use that's sort of in line with their belief system, whether or not we can back it up with our own Western version of science.
Great, thank you. And winding us up, Mr. Cannings, for 1.5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you. I'm going to stick with Dr. Heller again. Dr. Heller, you're listed as an Indigenous Fellow at Simon Fraser University. Just wondering if you could quickly comment on how you think the education system in Canada, especially the post-secondary education system, is adapting to this and creating new positions, chairs in Indigenous knowledge. We've heard from my friend and colleague, Dr. Jeanette Armstrong at UBC. I'm just wondering if you could comment on how that trend is going and whether it could be going faster.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think first of all, offering opportunities and scholarships for students, is important and trying to eliminate some of the financial barriers that they face. But, I think more than simply, doing mass hires of, Indigenous teaching faculty, is hiring Indigenous leaders in leadership positions and compensating them adequately, having elders in residence and giving them the same value as tenured faculty and compensating them appropriately. I think it's difficult, for Indigenous people to come into an institution when that institution isn't ready to receive the gifts that they have, isn't ready to see the value in the community work that Indigenous scholars have to put in simply because of the way that we are and the value that we put into giving back to our community and making the path a little bit easier for our children coming through. So again, I think it's hiring more people, but establishing policy changes in governance, changes in curriculum. So all levels of the institution going through a process of decolonization so that we can bring our values to the institution.
Well, great. Thank you. Boy, I wish this discussion could go on longer. We've had some terrific meetings, and this one certainly ranks among the tops on this study. So thank you to our witnesses for your insights, your input, and your thoughtful answers. If you have anything else that you'd like to share, please do that in writing so that we can include that in our study. But thank you to Lindsay Heller, Dr. Erica Dick, and Dr. Monica Williams for everything you've done for our study to get a better knowledge on Indigenous traditional knowledge and science in government policy development. So we're now going to suspend for a few minutes while we get our next witness dialed in. We only have one witness via Zoom in the next session, so we'll be back in a couple of minutes, and as soon as we've done our sound checks. Thank you again to our witnesses, and I look forward to the next part of our meeting. get going on the second part of our meeting. We've finished the sound checks, and thank you to our tech support on all of that. Welcome back pursuant to Standing Order 10831 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, September 18th, 2023. The committee resumes its study on the integration of Indigenous traditional knowledge and science in government policy development. It's now my pleasure to welcome via video conference Dr. Corey Chewy, who's Indigenous Science Consultant, and also in person we have Yves Gingras, Professor of History and Sociology of Science from Université du Québec à Montréal. You'll each have 5 minutes for your remarks, and then we will proceed to our round of questions. Again, if you're on video conference, you can choose the language of your choice at the bottom for English, French, or the floor. So we'll get started with Dr. Chewy for 5 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you. Tansi Miko Pahiso and Nisiga-san. I'm Métis and from the Jobin family, and mentioned I have a PhD in Indigenous mathematics and science. And I just want to get right to it. I'd like to start with what is science, and really it's how we understand, learn from, and connect with this ever-changing world that is around us so that we can survive and thrive and interpret these ancestral land-based teachings to pass these on to the next generation to survive and to survive. But these relational definitions that is science have really been disconnected from the land, from those trees, those willows, those beavers, disconnected from the human, from ourselves as with our body, our senses, our memories, our spirit, but also from community. And this is all because of the doctrine of discovery, this disconnect between the mind and the body from Descartes, the Indian Act, capitalism, and the clout of the scientific method. And this has led to this reductionist, objective, universal, standardized definition of science, of which many people today are using, which is great, but it's understood and passed on and used for scientific research. And what I would like to say is, what if these knowledges, what is missing if these knowledges are the only way of knowing science in the world around us today? What are we missing? So what I'd like to do with myself and my students is this framework of how do we open minds and hearts to relational or ancestral or indigenous science. And there's 3 ways that I do this: through origins, methods, and language. So origins is, what is the origin of this scientific discovery? And I put that in air quotes, or knowledge. And if we look beyond what we are taught in school through the global or scientific lens, we see that these knowledges are really connected and in depth with Indigenous people. Or if we look through the scientific lens, we can say that Niels Bohr was the founding father of quantum theory, or a French scientist discovered aspirin. But really, these knowledges of the spiritual and energetic connections to the land, where everyone for thousands of years have understood these causes and effects of frequencies and energy, have called this spirit, but now many call this quantum. Or women on Turtle Island have had ceremonial and spiritual connections with the healing medicines of willow, but many now know this as aspirin. So the second thing I'd like to talk about is methods, and how this is how we know science. And I want to chat about quantum a little bit. So through this Western scientific lens, they've had a difficulty in really understanding quantum through this Western scientific method because it's too universal, it's standardized, and it's objective. But through a Western or an Indigenous scientific lens, it is subjective, it's relational, includes observation, experience, and spirit. It's understanding that we learn not just through the objective knowledge or the written word, but through apprenticeship, story, ceremony, and spirit. For example, celestial knowledge that is passed on for thousands of years has been connected to specific locations and star phenomenon like the wolf eyes or thunderbird eggs. And only recently, Western scientists have claimed and discovered this knowledge, like the Sagittarius A star, or the supermassive black hole in the middle of the Earth, or in the middle of the universe. But this knowledge has been known and gifted through relationality and ceremony of Indigenous people for thousands of years. And the third thing I'd like to mention is language. How do we talk about science? And using Indigenous languages that are relational, that connect with the spirit, that are and the speaker, that are verb-based, they're alive, they have a past, present, and future. This allows this relationality to come to the forefront. And there's a depth of science within Indigenous knowledges. I'd like to give you an example. Namu is the word for bee. The Blackfoot word for bee is taught to me by Reg Croshu from the Piikani Nation. And it actually means the changes in frequency that of the sounds of the bee coming towards you and moving away from you. This is the relational Doppler effect. It denotes an understanding and a depth of scientific knowledge of movement, of relationality, of frequencies, of quantum, all within this one little Blackfoot word. I'm not saying that one or another way of knowing, being, or doing science is right or wrong, but there is harm in significant scientific knowledge that's discredited if only Western, global, or scientific methods and methodologies and policies are understood, validated, and passed on. So I have 3 recommendations I'd like to give. One is do your work first. Help us work on this parallel path with us. A reconciliation is the work of non-Indigenous people. And this was told to me by Casey Eagle, speaker from Guyana. Read the TRC, read the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Report, read UNDRIP, understand those testimonies. Understand what free, prior, informed consent is. Read books by Kahete, Kimmerer, Yellowbird, Vine Deloria Jr., listen to podcasts like Ancestral Science or Native Stories. But most importantly, get some tobacco, offer it to an elder, and just listen. Second recommendation is that really the sovereignty of this process must start with and stay with Indigenous communities. Really, we have to hand over this Indigenous making power, or the decision-making power, to communities. This will allow for this to be done in a good way through protocols, with this parallel path, with respect, and to mitigate cultural appropriation that's been brought up a few times beforehand.
I'm sorry, but
and lastly,
unfortunately,
really, we need to.
Fortunately, we're at time, so maybe we can get the third one into an answer, or you could provide that in writing.
That was my last one, is to take time for this.
Okay, very good. Okay, my bad on that. Thank you very much. That time is the one thing that we always run out of in this committee. And to Yves Gingras for 5 minutes, please.
Merci de votre invitation.
Thank you for inviting me. I think it's probably the first time that a committee like yours, that is the Standing Committee on Science and Research, is looking at the consequences of integrating Indigenous knowledge into scientific policy and into government policy as a whole. I think it's the first time that this is based on an understanding of science and epistemology. We cannot think that epistemology means that a science is disconnected from policy. I would say that a lot of this science is poorly conceived and poorly determined. As was said by a famous scientist, poorly determining something is adding to the ills of the world. All policy should be informed by openness and consultation, but consulting isn't the same thing as accepting. One of the reasons why the waters are a bit muddled here is that some things need to be distinguished. For instance, the word table must be distinguished from the word chair because they don't mean the same thing. If there's one thing you need to remember from my speech, it's that beliefs are valid and beliefs are held by people who have certain knowledge. But we have to retrace knowledge from hypotheses. So what is knowledge? Knowledge is a statement based on something that was validated by accessible methods that are accessible from any person who has the adequate knowledge to do so. That is knowledge. So if I make the hypothesis that there are bears somewhere, then I must go and verify this, and then it becomes knowledge. If I go there and see bears, and other people do the same, then this becomes universal. It becomes knowledge. Now, that's knowledge. And then we have science. Science is different from knowledge. I can know that 2 times 2 equals 4, or a2 squared plus b2 squared equals c2 squared. That's knowledge, but it doesn't mean that I can define it. In epistemology, we need to be able to determine knowledge through natural causes, and that's been the fundamental basis of science. For example, consider Tuia occidentalis, a tree. It has been discovered by the Iroquois that the leaves from that tree can cure certain diseases. The cedar tree, Tuya cedar, was called Aneda in Iroquois, and this knowledge has been discovered prior to the discovery of vitamin C curing scurvy. Here we have the science of curing scurvy. So we need to be able to distinguish knowledge and science. I'm not here to give you a science lesson, but you all know that science is potentially universal. There is no Western science. This concept does not exist. There's no Eastern science, and there's no indigenous science. This does not exist. There are individuals who have made discoveries. Certain Iroquois have discovered how to cure scurvy. We don't go to the moon using various knowledge. It was used under other scientific discoveries. Think of Newton. It's the same thing. There was a scientist called Mr. Maxwell, and we don't call the scientific knowledge he's produced Scottish science. Knowledge is potentially universal. Barring that, it is a belief. If I tell you I know of a God, then you'll tell me, no, you believe in God because there is no universal method to prove that God is there. So if we confound all these words, we're not going to get anywhere. So before saying that something is knowledge, it needs to be verified by people all over the place. Arabic numbers have been used since before the Middle Ages, and algebra comes from an Arabic word. Scientists from all countries contribute to science in a way that is potentially universal, and we cannot confound all terms.
Really good start of a discussion. I look forward to the questions on both the presentations. We'll start with Mr. Soroka for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for that, and thank you to the witnesses for coming today. I'll start off with Dr. Chewy, though. You've already alluded to how Indigenous stories have helped understanding, but can you deepen our understanding of these stories within mathematical and scientific concepts, especially in the context of your work in children and treaties?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So stories is knowledge. When we tell a story, we're teaching, whatever that may be. And for me, for my research, I never connected with math when I was in school. Didn't connect with my body, my culture, my spirit, the land, until I realized that when I was doing my master's, when I realized that that is a way of being and knowing mathematics that is very standardized, and there's nothing wrong with that. And it creates a disconnect between humans and cultures and how people have done math for many years. You think about the significance of trigonometry and how much communities that have navigated the ocean have done just in their heads, just to navigate through the zenith and the horizon and whatnot. It's significant, and that is connected to body and senses. And when those ways of understanding, knowing, being, and doing mathematics is removed through a way of understanding it that is about memorization, that is a very standardized, that is done in a classroom on a piece of paper, then there's not that connection. And for me, once I realized there is ways of understanding math that has a relationality, I began to connect with it more. And that's how I work with children, is how do you see the math around you? How do you understand how different angles create different seasons? Or how do you count using or measure using your body and not necessarily a standardized ruler, because we are our own standardized measurement. When I was doing my master's, I did some work within Papua New Guinea, different number systems, and it's different base systems between different communities from base 32 to base 27, and they're all significant and different. And I realized that how much that would help understanding mathematics, because these communities, as they're trading, between these different number systems, they had to interpret and change different systems. And that's what we are doing every day. And that helps us every day when we are telling the time to coding a computer. So these are all connected to based in our bodies and our methods of understanding the world around us. But when we learn a mathematics in school that is very standardized and disconnected from these our body or culture or experiences, then we don't have that same connection. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it's great. Thank you, Dr. Chewy, for that. My next question is to you as well. In your role at the Spark Science Center, how do you facilitate the integration of multiple ways of knowing science?
In multiple ways. There are ways that we do it through, first of all, community connections, and really starting with the elders and knowledge keepers and Indigenous scientists, and listening to them on their knowledges and what they would like to bring in. And secondly, through education of how do we create events that are connected to Indigenous science so that everybody can understand. So there's that connection that people can get in understanding the frequencies of drums and the healing of those frequencies to different star maps and whatnot. We also do a lot of work with schools and community to bring experiences out to community, and that is both schools and on the land, like communities and on the res, and how to allow for them to see the depth of science within their knowledge. We do this with an experiential workshop that explores the depth of knowledge with Blackfoot stories of Makawiyoksukwoi, or the Milky Way, and that actually is connected to many, many scientific teachings within that story, and that goes back to that original question about story, and that story is knowledge. That Wolf Trail story has significant scientific knowledges within it, within how predator-prey relationships and living in balance, and talk specifically about a point in the sky that only a few years ago, if you remember that supermassive black hole that was photographed, we're like, we've known that for thousands of years. That's the wolf eye, or the Thunderbird egg. Many stories. So there's a lot of science within these knowledges, and at the Science Center, we try to bring those together and make them relatable and for everyone, not just for Indigenous communities and children and people to see themselves in science, which often I never saw myself in science or mathematics when I was growing up. So to have these experiences would have been significant for me. So we're trying to do that, but also for everyone, so that everyone can experience and understand the depth of these knowledges, these scientific knowledges that are within these stories. And stories, I mean, it is science. It is connection with the land.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Chewy, on that. Just one more question, and I know I'm getting close to my time, so you might have to put this in writing back to us. But based on your research and professional experience, what are some of the challenges and opportunities in integrating Indigenous traditional knowledge with scientific research and policymaking?
Thank you. And that does look like a homework question. And it's a very good question indeed.
That's a very big question.
We'll have to move on to our next questioner, Valerie Bradford, for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. So perhaps I'll give you the opportunity then to address MP Soroka's question.
Sure. Can you repeat the question? It was a big one.
Yes, I'll let the MP repeat it again.
Yeah, not a problem. Based on your research and professional experience, what are some challenges and opportunities in integrating Indigenous traditional knowledge with scientific research and policymaking?
Which is basically what this report is all about. So if you could write a report for us. No.
Yeah, just give you that report. That's great. I think there's so many challenges because the way, like I mentioned, there's such a narrow, seemingly narrow from an Indigenous perspective, a definition of science and how we do be and know science and math. And to me, science and math, it's under the same umbrella of thriving and understanding the world around us. And unless we can expand that understanding, then I don't know how to move forward. And if we continuously say that we can only do this more objective, standardized method of doing, knowing science, and not just understanding that, but implementing it through the written word or through a couple of consultations, and not through ceremony, then it's not gonna be done in a good way. So there has to be, the challenge is how do we bring together, and as mentioned many times before, this idea of weaving and braiding, it's bringing these ways of knowing together because all of them have strengths, but we've only been often taught that a Western or global scientific way of knowing, being, and doing science is the only way to do it. How do we open that up and braid these knowledges together? So it's the challenges is really truly understanding what that means. And the opportunity, I think, is not like understanding that, what are we missing when we're not understanding science in this way. And there's so many examples that I can say that, you know, I said that example of just that one simple Blackfoot word of Namu and the amount of science within that, and how Indigenous languages are being lost and not being passed on to the next generation. For how long?
Okay, I think now I want to ask my questions. Thank you for that very fulsome answer, though. That's great. And thank you to both of our witnesses and the passion and enthusiasm of your opening statements. It was quite remarkable. So I want to get back, Dr. Chewy, to you gave us three things, even though the chairman often was trying to cut you off with timing. The first one that you said was that we should do our work first, and reconciliation is the work of non-Indigenous people. So can you talk to the committee more about the importance of building partnerships with the federal, provincial, municipal, and post-secondary institutions and industry to support Indigenous governance and reconciliation? What are your suggestions for how we make that happen?
There's all the suggestions. There's the TRC, there's UNDRIP, they're all there. We just have to do them. And it's doing that work to understand what those mean and to bring forth, like, we've done our work. I mentioned a ton of resources. There's a lot of work that have been done on how to do this in a good way and how to do this with us, with community. And that parallel path I have to walk that parallel path every day. I have to do double the amount of work to do the work that I do. And I'm fine with that. But other people have to do that too. And it's to understand, to do that work and to read and to explore, like, what is that more subjective way of knowing science? Once you experience that, there's no question on what is belief, what is knowledge. Okay. Then we're on the same path.
I wonder if you could expand a little bit more for us on your role as Manager of Indigenous Engagement at the TELUS Science Centre. Those of us from Ontario were really not even familiar with the TELUS Science Centre. We know about the two here in Ontario. So can you elaborate on your role with that and how you actually do employ the traditional knowledge into the current policies and just incorporate it in your daily work there?
It is number one about community and the knowledge keepers and the elders. And that will always be the center of the work that I do. And it's building that trust in myself and building that trust in them to bring forth their ideas on what they think should happen. And nothing happens without community. Nothing happens without working with them and creating those relationships. And that's bottom line. That's not necessarily just at the Science Centre. That's any work that is done with Indigenous, anything should be done alongside with communities and starting with listening.
Well, I think it's wonderful that the TELUS Science Centre actually does have a manager of Indigenous engagement. I'm not sure that happens at other science centres, so wonderful. Is my time up? Okay.
Science North is doing some amazing things.
That's great. Well, that would make sense given that they are in the heart of an Indigenous community, so thank you for that. I'm glad to hear that. Okay, so I'll wrap it at that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. And now, Monsieur Blanchet-Choquat for 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Mes questions vont être pour Monsieur.
Thank you, Chair. My question will be for Mr. Gingras. Mr. Gingras, in your opening remarks, you've demonstrated how to parse apart knowledge, belief, and science. I have a question for you. Is there a universal definition of Indigenous knowledge? No. When we talk about knowledge, we need to view this wisdom as knowledge. We have heard the expression traditional knowledge. We need to look at this from an epistemological point of view. Just because something is traditional doesn't mean it's been anchored. For instance, in Europe, traditional medicine was asked doctors to bleed their patients. This happened for 1,500 years. This was traditional knowledge. And then doctors were starting to ask themselves, does bleeding patients actually work? And does bloodletting actually work? And now nobody does this practice anymore. Take homeopathy as another example. Homeopathy was tested scientifically and it just doesn't work. You can take this a little granule, but it's not going to work. Now we are no longer in the 17th century, we're in the 21st century. Everything around you, for example, televisions, aren't the product of new science. Science is always forward-looking, never looking back. And it's important to know that the keepers of knowledge do certain things. In the discussion we've talked about, we've heard pedagogy come up. If we can teach certain researchers how to do mathematics, that's one thing. But if you are going to the moon, you need to use advanced algebra. It's not based on a traditional or ancestral knowledge. It's maybe savoir du jour, but I would say that if you are integrating this traditional knowledge, you're not going to get anywhere. What you need to do is to go visit people on the ground and then confirm it. And if that is confirmed, it becomes knowledge. Without that, it's just tradition. I have nothing against tradition, but science pushes us forward. Albert Einstein discovered relativity. Is this a Jewish science? No. Albert Einstein was Jewish, of course. You know, the Nazis believed in Jewish science. The communists believes in the science of the proletariat. That doesn't exist. There is science that is done by Chinese people, by German people, etc. So you really need to understand this, or else you're going to head into a direction that history has proven to be dangerous. You are associating science to one group. There is no Quebec science. There is no Canadian science. There are simply Quebecers and Canadians who are scientists. If you believe in Canadian science and Quebec science, you are therefore believing in Russian science, and Jewish science, and Chinese science, etc. We need to make this distinction because it's going to be crucial for making the distinctions you need going forward. These distinctions are not based in traditional knowledge. These are what philosophers would call validated distinctions. These are distinctions that are made by the methods that we know. We have computers, we have math, we have, since Galileo, methods that are universally used, that is all over the world, from people who want to develop everywhere. I'd like to hear you talk about the scientific process. Some researchers have told us that there's a hierarchy in wisdom and knowledge. Some would not want to compare Indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge to the currently empirical data we have. I believe that this is founded on a foregone conclusion. There is no hierarchy of knowledge. You can have valid or invalid results. In the 15th century, the French and British scientists were arguing whether the Earth was perfectly round or if it was flattened at the equator, at the poles. There were multiple theories, and there was conflicting theories. So what did they do? Well, they didn't say that, oh, there's a British knowledge and there's French knowledge. There was then a team sent to the both poles and determined that the Earth itself is a bit squished because it does turn on itself. As you may know, I was a physics professor in CEGEP in another life. And so I can tell you that the Earth is turning, and that's that. Newton might have determined something, but we're not going to say that it was British science because Newton was British. Whether something is true or false is one thing, but it is not Chinese. That is for sure. Thank you. Mr. Shangri. What are the consequences, potentially, of informing public policy with a traditional knowledge without double checking this from a scientific point of view? What effect could this have on government policy? Foreseeably, if you don't use validated methods, you won't get anywhere. We hear a lot about evidence and probative data. And probative data can be validated. If we don't use that kind of data, it won't work. You need to validate something first. Don't just believe me. For example, I live in Montmorency. If I tell you something about the Montmorency Falls, don't believe me instantly. You have to go to Montmorency Falls to see it for themselves. The communities around them need to determine this.
And I'm sorry that I have to cut you off, but Mr. Cannings for 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you for both witnesses being here today. I'm going to start with Dr. Chewy. First, I just want to hear more about, you talked quite a bit about stories, and it made me think of Thomas King's quote, the truth about stories is that's all we are. And I come from a science background, and I remember in my university days the times when I was really learning things is when I heard stories, from the professors that really, put you in a place where you could actually see patterns and those type of things. I remember the only way I learned anything about calculus was actually studying astronomy first, and I always objected to teaching of biology where in the university you started with cell chemistry, which is the most abstract way of trying to engage any young person in studying something. And if you stuck around for 4 years, you might actually get out in the woods and see the real world. So I'm just wondering if you could maybe expand on that in your work with Indigenous science.
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned, when working with children and kids, anyone, and the first thing I do is take them outside. And actually, one of my assignments right now with my university class is go out on the land and learn something, and the land will tell you, they will teach you something. And those are those truly relational methods. And that starts a story. When you're out on the land and you are listening to the leaves, and then a few months later, the sound of those leaves change because the water is leaving those leaves and preparing for the cycle of the winter, and how those frequencies can teach you something. Or learning from a squirrel and how they can preserve food and how they use specific plants to actually preserve certain foods. And those chemical and biological methods we learn from the squirrel. And those are stories. And how cool would it be to start your chemistry lesson with hanging out with a squirrel and learning how they preserve stuff? That those stories we can connect with those. Both we can see it, which is something very cool. We can experience it, and it creates an emotion in ourselves. It creates a relationship and a relationality. And as you mentioned, a story. And those are those ways, not the written word. Those stories are how this knowledge has been passed down. As I mentioned, these scientific stories, they're not written down in books. There's no clay tablets from thousands of years ago that Indigenous people have written down on these lands. It is through stories that are passed on. But yes, these change as the generations passing them on, but the essence of them are the same. And those Those are those, if we want to say peer review, I always mention the person and the community that passed on that story and that knowledge to me. That is that peer review. We can go back. You can go back to those elders, community members. You can validate the knowledge that I said. I may say it in a way that is more relational and that allows us to connect. And that's that story method. And that's how that connection, that knowledge is passed on. And that is different than just reading something. So it can be very similar knowledges, but it's a way that creates that connection and relationality that is really brought about in story.
Well, thank you. And you also mentioned, I think, a parallel path. And I just wondered if you could expand on that, because I'm wondering whether you meant that Indigenous knowledge and quote-unquote scientific knowledge are on parallel paths. Parallel paths tend not to meet. I'm just wondering if there is a way of meeting bringing those two things together when we are formulating government policy, for instance. That's what we're talking about here today.
Absolutely. In that case, parallel path is more of a let's walk alongside one another and support one another. And that's back to wampum belt teachings that I don't have the rights or feel comfortable passing on, but look up and you can offer some tobacco and ask about wampum belt teachings. But it is how do we walk together on this path together, side by side. Weaving things together is how do we similarly support it, where it retains its integrity. It's, they're similar, but a little bit different. But absolutely, it is. We have to support one another. And that parallel path of I've walked in both worlds. I understand how I can do science and how I can speak in both worlds. And asking that, can we walk on this parallel path, is also asking other people that are involved to do the same and to do that work and to help us to come again on the same page, if you may, to walk together on this path together so we can best understand one another and support one another.
Oh, apparently I'm done, so thank you very much.
Thank you. Really enjoying this this conversation. Over to Ben Lobb for 5 minutes, please.
Thanks very much. And maybe our last committee meeting before Mr. Cannings retires, he can tell us all of his stories, and we might find those pretty interesting.
I liked him quoting King. He's a Guelphite, Thomas. Anyway. Oh.
Yeah. Ms. Chewy, my question for you is, you mentioned in your presentation at the end about free, prior, and informed consent. And I was just wondering, as someone who's so proficient in mathematics and has worked extensively within many communities, I'm just curious, is there a finite period of time, or is there a calculation and a solution where a business, let's say, that wants to build a mine or whatever it might be, and a community or communities that might be impacted by that mine, that may be for the good or for not the good, is there a way for the community to say, yes, we can check all the boxes here, and we have been consulted with, and we've been informed, etc. Is there a calculation for that? Is there a way, or is it still a process that every community is working through?
Answer is probably no. Every community is different, and every community has a different level of trust in these processes with whoever organization or whatnot they may be involved with. And it has to start from the beginning. Any of this work that's being done, whether it be a mine or whatever it may be, it has to start from the very first conversation. Oh, we're thinking of doing this. Let's talk to community. Where that is that parallel path. That is working together side by side. It's not, we're going to do all this planning, we've invested all this money, and the blueprints are out, and then, let's see if it's okay. Because then it's already done. That's not the prior. Free, they don't have to pay, they don't have to work with this. Prior, informed, they are informed with all of the information that is available, possible. And even that consent, even afterwards, that is a relationship that has to start from the beginning. And the timelines, time is a colonial construct. And it's very much the community's time is not going to align with business timelines, because community, their priorities is community. Their priority is seasonal change. And when oh, well, we can't make this meeting because that's the same day as the ceremony. That is priority, where it is a respect of those priorities. Same as it has, again, it's that parallel path. So that's probably not the answer you want to hear. And I apologize for that, but it is reality.
For any particular answer, just your answer. Yeah. The other thing I was going to ask you about is just if you turn on the news every night and you look at just the strife amongst, call them Western democracies, I guess you could say, or just the issues in Canada, in our cities and in our small communities, there are a lot of issues. What are some takeaways from Indigenous communities that might provide some benefit to community, to benefit to society? Do you have any comments or thoughts on that?
I do. I think I'll reference Robin Ball Kimmerer, a member of the Potawatomi community, Braiding Sweetgrass. Read it. But I like to. She said something beautiful in that. When is Mother Earth going to thank humans for being here? Because she gives so much. Everything we have is from the earth, and we take all of that. But when do we give back? And thinking about that, everything is an ancestor. Everything gives us something. Everything is alive. How do we give back for that food that you bought from the grocery store instead of just taking it and paying for it? And really understanding those relationships, those cycles, those relationalities. And just having that moment of appreciation and respect and responsibility that really we have to the earth and to everything around us to give back and to have that gratitude. We have a responsibility of being on this land, and we're not really being accountable to that responsibility. And I think thinking about that maybe shift some mindsets a little bit.
Well, terrific. Thank you. I just had to get that braiding sweetgrass written down. Indigenous Reads Month is coming up, and that needs to be on my list. Thank you for the great questions, Mr. Lobb. And now we'll go over to Dr. Jacek for the next 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And over the break, I did read Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Kimmerer and found it helpful in terms of the work of this committee. But just to bring us back to the work of this committee, our study charges us to make recommendations on how best to integrate Indigenous traditional knowledge and science into government policy development and how to resolve conflicts between the two knowledge systems. And they've clearly differentiated in this request that there are two knowledge systems. So on a practical basis, Dr. Chui, could you give us some suggestions on how we can do this in terms of what can the government of Canada do?
I believe I've already said that. The government of already, we have to walk alongside one another. How many Indigenous people are in that room right now? How is your plan to work alongside communities throughout this process and not just today or through these meetings? And I suggest it is something that communities have to be a part of at every step, not just these conversations, which are a great starting point. But I think it really is about an ongoing work. And again, doing the work. Love that you've read Braiding Sweetgrass. I think there's a lot of going to community and really seeing and experiencing what Indigenous science is. And then I think maybe that that question of the conflict of Indigenous and Western science, maybe that would be removed. How do we bring it together where there's not a conflict? Is understanding. We understand what Western science, global science is. Everybody understands what that is. but understanding the value of Indigenous science, understanding how those methods are different, understanding how do we connect with those. I think that is a great move for everyone to try to really understand.
Give some examples of
them.
Academic institutions that are operating in this way. Any provincial governments that have given us some examples, or perhaps even international examples of where this has been effective?
I think there are many examples, and maybe I can send that in later. But I think the examples of the ways that this has been done well is when Indigenous people are at the forefront. If you look at any of the Maori universities in New Zealand, they are at the forefront of everything. They are at the decision-making level of this work, and that's just how it is. And examples, and I will say, yes, I have a PhD and I work for universities, but the most significant knowledge that I have ever been gifted is I say that my elders have a PhD, and that's, we can go and understand the Western system, but it is the elders with the PhD of the land, and I put that in air quotes, because they really have the knowledge that can help us bring this together. And they should be the ones that are in the decision-making level as well.
Dr. Gingras, I would invite you to just address the purpose of our study, and if you have any comments.
Yes, I think that we need concrete mechanism, not vague metaphors about collaborating mechanism. I'll take a very simple example. Peer review is done in science double-blind. Why is it double-blind? Is that because when you send a paper, you want it to be evaluated really as if it's good, and you don't want cognitive bias to move it in a bad direction. So when you send a paper, you don't have the name of the individual, you don't have the name of the institution, because if it's written Harvard University, you may say, oh, maybe it's a good paper. So double-blind works. It means that when you're consulting on a policy, you're consulting everyone who has an expertise. And then you make a decision in the end. There's no 2 ways, there's no 5 ways. Since the 17th century, the Chinese don't say yin and yang to go on the moon. They say, I learned from Newton, I learned from Einstein, I learned from everyone. I don't want to know the color of your skin. I don't want you to know your community. Do I speak for the Quebecers? That does not exist. I am a Quebecer, and I make my decision. So your committee to integrate, I'm sorry, I think it's simpler than we think. If you are in an environment policy in a given place, you have a committee talking to everyone who wants to talk, and we already do that in environmental studies. Some comes, they say, I don't think you should do that for this or that reason. But that reason must be consensual, and that's what the Supreme Court decided also. The Judge Binney said that if you want an expertise at the Supreme Court, this expertise must be subjected to the usual methods of the scientific community.
Okay.
Why? Because that's the only way to be sure that it's true and
thank you.
It can be verified. So there are mechanisms. They are not complicated, I think.
Thank you. We've got the thought down. Thank you very much to Mr. Blanchet-Choca for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'll continue with you, Mr. Gingras. You gave examples from a historical point of view with the geocentrism, heliocentrism, Galileo, and whatnot. Human beings have been confronted to religious beliefs for aeons. There are distinctions, and there has been the development of a scientific method. I would like to hear your thoughts on this opposition between non-Indigenous and Indigenous peoples in regard to this conversation. There can be differences among Indigenous peoples in how they conceive science and knowledge. As there is no homogeneous communities. There are, for instance, among one racial community, there are people who vote liberal, conservative, or otherwise. We need to be careful that there are no forms of neo-racism that are created. This could be dangerous from a sociological perspective. society has the following model: people must be equal and have equal access to education. If we want to bring people to school, and we need to be able to give them equal access to various knowledge, so that Arabic students, for example, don't say, hey, this is our knowledge. When we discriminate between sources of knowledge, history has taught us that this can be dangerous. What we need is universities, CEGEPs, and grants that are universal, that will help people improve the environment around them. And they're not going to do that by praying. You can't pray climate change away. You need better technology that everyone needs to contribute. Why are there some countries that aren't contributing? Well, it's because there's poorer countries and there's lesser access to education. We're not living in this abstract, crypto-religious world here. Science has transcended this since the 17th century. We are now living in a techno-scientific world. We cannot return to a community-based dialogue.
To bring us home.
Okay, thanks. Well, I'd just like to turn back to Dr. Chewy and talk about, you mentioned, just out of my own curiosity, you mentioned some of the different numerical base systems used by Indigenous communities, and I remember studying Central American Indigenous astronomy systems when I was in university, the mines using base 20. Just wondering if you could perhaps give us a few examples of that kind of Indigenous knowledge around the world that deals with how they are seeing and making sense of the universe.
Absolutely. Everyone, Indigenous languages, Indigenous knowledges, they're not universal, but there is a universality of a connection to a specific land. Indigenous people have a spiritual, relational connection to the land, and the land teaches them. And from that has arisen mathematics and science and chemistry and whatnot from around the world. And with that, number systems, we use base 10 from our 10 fingers. But many Indigenous people use different, like you mentioned, base 20 for your 10 fingers, 10 toes. And all of these have cultural connections. A really cool example that was taught to me when I was doing some work in Hawaii. If you want some more diverse examples, is there's a base 4 in Hawaii, and 4 is very significant because fish is very significant, and fish farms are very significant, and it was their food source. So people will go down to the fish farms and the fish traps that are thousands and thousands of years old, and they would catch fish, and they would bring them back to their community. Each fish they could hold between each of their fingers. So it's 4 fish and 4 fish. Because that was so significant, everything revolved around 4 and base 4. And when we say that base 4 is not significant, or we say that it's not valid, or we say that this way of knowing that is very significant to this community that has deep scientific and mathematical and biological connections, when we say that that is less valid, it is harmful. And I think it's very interesting to embrace the diversities within these knowledges and what we can learn from them for ourselves as well.
Terrific. Well, that's a great note to end on. Getting into base 4 and base 20, I have an English degree and a math minor, and the stories between the two of how do you construct a theorem, whether it's in English or mathematics, is a whole other thing that my head has been going around as we talk. So thank you to our witnesses, to Corey Chuki and Yves Gingras, for your testimonies and your participation, and for making us think in new ways, so that we can do our study on integration of Indigenous traditional knowledge and science in government policy development. Again, if you have any additional information you'd like to share with the committee, it would be helpful for us. We will be adjourning, but before we do, just a reminder that we'll be getting together on Thursday, February 8th with regards to this study for some more testimony, and then we'll be winding up this study next Tuesday with testimony. So is it the will of the committee to adjourn? Yes? Okay, thank you. Thank you again to our witnesses.